The moment I crossed the threshold of that ballroom, I heard her say it. She didn't have to raise her voice much. The sentence traveled through the air, fragrant with imported flowers, cut through the murmur of the guests, and lodged itself directly in my ears as if launched with surgical precision. Isabel Montgomery, my brother's perfect fiancée, was leaning toward her bridesmaids, a champagne flute in her hand, impeccably put together, nude nails, an engagement ring sparkling as if competing with the chandeliers. Her head was tilted, her smile just right, and her whisper was just loud enough to cross the room. And I know with the certainty that I know my own name, she did it on purpose. Oh great, the smelly little country bumpkin is here. Her friends let out little giggles like a pack of hyenas wrapped in silk and tulle, drenched in expensive perfume and the confidence of those who are convinced the world is a mirror designed to adore them. None of them turned around. Isabel didn't even bother to look at me when she said it. To her, I was that insignificant, just an embarrassment that had crawled out of some small town to ruin the aesthetic of her engagement party. If it had been years ago, maybe I would have shrunk. I would have pretended not to hear. I would have looked for a dark corner to disappear into. But that time was long gone. Because what Isabel didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I signed the deed to this hotel 3 years ago. The Monarch Hotel. Every chandelier above her head, every piece of silver cutlery she used to bring delicate bites to her mouth, every inch of Italian marble under those ridiculously expensive heels. It was mine. Those enormous mirrors, that perfect lighting, the acoustics that made her insult travel with such precision. All mine. And before this night was over, that whisper was going to cost her everything she ever wanted. My name is Valerie Baxter. I'm 31, and I grew up in Oak Haven, Pennsylvania, a town so small that the only traffic jam we ever had was when Old Man Miller's cows got out and blocked Main Street for 3 hours. The sheriff put up traffic cones, the cows stared him down, and the whole town came out to take pictures. That was our big traffic chaos. I left home at 18 and never really looked back. Not because I hated where I came from. I loved Oak Haven with its cracked sidewalks and its bakery that smelled of butter from 2 blocks away. But because my family made it crystal clear there was no room for me. I have an older brother, Matthew, the golden boy, the son who could do no wrong, the one who always knew what to say, how to stand, when to smile. I grew up with everything I did being compared to him, and I always came up short. If I got an A, Matthew got an A+ with honors. If I made the softball team, Matthew was already captain of the baseball team. If I came home happy about a drawing taped to the fridge, one of his diplomas was already occupying the main spot. My mother, Lorraine, had a special way of looking at me that made me feel like a rough draft, while Matthew was the finished masterpiece, framed and hung in the living room. I remember one afternoon, I must have been about 12, I brought home a certificate for winning a writing contest. I was proud, my fingers still stained with cheap ink. My mother barely looked up from the pot on the stove. She said it was nice, but not to get distracted, that the serious subjects were what mattered. That same week, Matthew scored 2 goals in a school soccer game, and my mother threw an entire dinner party to celebrate him. It's not that Matthew was mean to me. He was just used to the spotlight following him. When you're someone's shadow, you learn to move in the margins, to observe everything without being seen. And there, without knowing it, I started training for what was to come. So I left. The morning of my departure, there was no drama, no tears, no pleas for me to stay. I packed what I could into a worn-out suitcase, folded my favorite sweatshirt twice, and tucked my notebook into an inside pocket. I took a bus to the city with nothing more than $200, a stubborn refusal to fail, and the echo of my grandmother's voice in my ear. You are not less than anyone, child. Back in Oak Haven, everyone probably imagined I was suffering, cooped up in a tiny room, eating instant noodles and crying at night. And the truth is, that was true for the first 2 years. I worked cleaning tables at a diner, then handing out flyers, then folding clothes in a store where no one learned my name. I slept in a studio with paper-thin walls. I listened to the neighbors fighting, a baby crying, the television from the apartment below always on full blast. What they didn't know during their Sunday afternoon gossip sessions was that I got a job as a housekeeper at a boutique hotel, and that job changed my life. The first day I walked through the service entrance, The smell was a mix of cleaning solution, fresh coffee, and nerves. They gave me a uniform that was too big, a cart with supplies, and a list of rooms. No one expected anything from me, and that suited me perfectly. I watched, I studied, I learned everything. How the receptionist spoke, how the shift manager solved problems, how a small detail, a fresh flower, a handwritten note could make a guest return. I listened to conversations in the hallways, jotted things down in my notebook on my breaks. I asked questions when it was safe to ask. I climbed the ladder step by step, from cleaning rooms to the front desk, from the front desk to assistant, from assistant to manager. Every promotion was a silent battle. Lots of overtime, strategic smiles, memorized data. I saved every penny, invested carefully, made smart decisions, and took risks when they made sense, not before. When others spent their tips on nights out, I was building a spreadsheet. While my coworkers were trying on shoes, I sat at the back of the bus reading about commercial mortgages and occupancy rates. At 28, I bought my first property, a small rundown motel by a secondary highway that everyone had given up for dead. I saw potential where others saw ruin. I renovated it slowly, room by room, negotiating with suppliers, learning to haggle as if my life depended on it. By 30, I had 3. Now, at 31, I run the Birchwood Group, a company that owns 6 boutique hotels along the East Coast. The Monarch is my jewel, my pride, my daily reminder that the invisible girl from Oakhaven built something solid, brick by brick. And there's something you learn when you build something from nothing. You learn to keep quiet. You learn to value silence as a weapon. You learn that people will underestimate you, and sometimes that's the most useful thing they can do for you. The men in suits who didn't take me seriously in meetings, I would smile, let them talk, and then sign deals they never saw coming. That's why I never told my family. They never asked either. To them, I was still the little sister who couldn't measure up to Matthew and his mid-level management job at an insurance company. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. That night, I received an invitation to Matthew's engagement party. Last minute, of course, an email with a vague subject line and a text from my mother saying it would be nice if I came, in the same tone you'd use to invite someone to a neighborhood watch meeting out of obligation. It was probably her idea, a guilt-driven invitation so she could tell her friends the whole family had attended. I almost didn't come. I closed the email, opened it again, left it in the drafts of my mind, but something pulled me here. Curiosity, perhaps, or a stubborn hope that something might have changed over all these years. That at least someone would ask, "So, Valerie, what have you been up to?" Nothing had changed. I stood at the entrance of my own hotel in dark jeans, my favorite soft leather boots, and my hair smelling faintly of the countryside because I had driven through Oakhaven on the way, just to remind myself where I came from. I stopped the car in front of the Old Town Square. I got out for a minute, breathed in that air of fresh-baked bread and old gasoline. I heard 2 old ladies gossiping by the pharmacy door. No one recognized me. No one had any reason to. Then I continued on to the Monarch. My outfit that night cost more than everything Isabel was wearing, but you wouldn't know it at a glance. That's how real money works. It doesn't need to scream or hang price tags where everyone can see them. I saw my mother across the ballroom, reigning over her circle of friends like the mayor of some imaginary town, probably bragging about Matthew's wonderful fiancé and the wonderful future that awaited them. Matthew was next to Isabel, with the face of someone who'd just won the lottery, not knowing the ticket was fake. He was laughing, nodding, his hand on the small of her back, like the hero of a cheap romance movie. Isabel finally looked my way, and her smile sharpened like a paper cut. She didn't recognize me as anything more than a nuisance, a stain on her perfect night, a wrong note in her carefully rehearsed symphony. I didn't care that she thought I was a nobody, that they all thought it. I learned long ago that the best revenge isn't loud. It's patient, silent, and lets people dig their own graves while they're looking over their shoulder. I gave her back a smile. That calm smile you use when you know something everyone else doesn't. I walked to the bar and ordered a drink. The bartender recognized me immediately but didn't let it show. My staff knew not to give me away. Simon Cross, my general manager, caught my eye from across the room and gave me a minimal nod. Everything was running perfectly. The service was flowing, the champagne was pouring. The kitchen was holding up under the pressure, perfect for now. Because in about 3 hours, Isabel Montgomery was going to learn an important lesson. Never underestimate the country bumpkin, especially when she owns the ground you're standing on. And before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment, and it truly means the world to me. Thanks for your support. Now, let's get back to the story. The party was exactly what you'd expect from someone like Isabel. Extravagant, over the top, designed to impress people who were already impressed with themselves. There were ice sculptures of swans too thin to be believable. A champagne fountain that seemed excessive even by champagne fountain standards. 3 tiers, lights underneath, bubbling like a golden volcano. And so many flowers that a botanical garden would have gotten jealous and demanded royalties. A string quartet was playing pop song covers, because nothing says class like pretending you don't recognize the melody of a hit song played on violins. My team had done an impeccable job. The centerpieces were perfect. The waitstaff moved in a silent ballet. Trays emerged from the kitchen as if guided by GPS. It filled me with pride, even as I internally rolled my eyes at every aesthetic decision Isabel had made, from the lace-edged tablecloths to the napkins folded into lotus flowers. I settled into a discreet corner to observe, my drink in hand, and then my mother appeared. Lorraine Baxter approached like a woman who has just smelled something unpleasant and is trying to locate the source. Her dress was elegant, understated, but her expression ruined the whole effect. She looked me up and down, lingering on my boots as if they were a fashion crime, with a disapproval so palpable you could almost touch it. She said it was good, I could make it, in a tone that meant the exact opposite. The word good came out strained, as if she'd had to chew it first. Then she asked why I hadn't worn something more appropriate, mentioning that Isabel's family was very refined. She pronounced refined as if it were a vocabulary word I was supposed to be studying for a test. Her left eyebrow rose a millimeter, the same eyebrow she used to correct my posture when I was a child. I told her I came straight from work and didn't have time to change, which was true. I just didn't mention that work meant running a multi-million-dollar hotel company. I could have told her my jeans were custom-made, that my boots cost more than Isabel's entire hairdo, but I didn't see the point. My mother sighed, the way she always sighed with me. That long, resigned sigh, as if I were a permanent disappointment she had learned to tolerate because she had no other choice. She told me to at least try to make a good impression on the Montgomerys, that they were important people, and then she disappeared back into the crowd to continue her social obligations, which mainly consisted of talking about the absent with those who were present. And there it was. 20 seconds of conversation, and I already felt like I was 12 again, failing some invisible rule that no one had explained to me but everyone expected me to know. I took a breath, counted to 5 in my head, and took a small sip so I wouldn't down the whole glass in one go. I looked over at Isabel on the other side of the room, air-kissing guests. That woman kissed more cheeks that night than a politician on the campaign trail, leaning in just enough, laughing a little louder than necessary. Every gesture was calculated, every smile measured for maximum effect, every glance thrown like a dart at the right person. Her parents, Hector and Veronica Montgomery, were nearby, preening as if they were royalty in exile. Hector was big, broad-shouldered, with a ruddy face and that confidence that comes from either real success or being very good at faking it. Veronica was thin, polished, perfectly taut, dripping with jewels that caught the light with every movement, like tiny private constellations. They looked rich, acted rich, moved rich, but something didn't add up, like a beautiful painting hung just slightly crooked. Something in the composition bothered the eye without you knowing exactly what. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but I knew I would. Then Matthew finally saw me and walked over, adjusting his tie on the way, looking at me the way he did when we were kids, and I was the annoying little sister who followed him everywhere with a notebook in her hand. He said he was glad I came, though his tone made it clear he didn't care whether I was there or not, that the night didn't revolve around my attendance. He asked if I had met Isabel yet and said she was incredible, that he'd never met anyone so... And he trailed off, searching for adjectives as if choosing from a catalog. Brilliant, sophisticated, special. I replied that I had seen her and kept the rest to myself. That comment about the ice swans was burning on my tongue. Matthew nodded, looking over my shoulder to see who else he needed to greet, which hand to shake, which smile to practice. Some things never change. And then he dropped a line that tightened my stomach like a punch from the inside. He mentioned that Mom had given Isabel Grandma's necklace as an engagement gift. "Wasn't that generous?" he said proudly, adding that Isabel loved it, that she said it had the perfect vintage vibe for her. The air left my lungs. That necklace, the antique pendant of aged gold, and an opaque blue stone that my grandmother had promised to me before she died. I remembered her wrinkled, soft hands, calling me to her room when the smell of eucalyptus filled the house. She took my hand and told me it was for me, because I was her dreamer, her fighter, the one who was going to make her own way, even if she had to hack it out with a machete. My mother knew. She was in the room when my grandmother said it, her lips pressed into a thin line, and yet she had given it to Isabel as if it were just some available trinket, as if the words of a dying old woman meant nothing. I looked up and saw it, hanging from Isabel's neck as if it belonged there, resting right in the hollow curve between her collarbones, glinting under the chandeliers as she laughed at something one of her friends said. The DJ turned the music up so loud I felt it rattling in my teeth. If I wanted my teeth to chatter, I'd rather go to the dentist and at least get a free toothbrush. The bass thumped in my chest, and the lights changed color, as if the ballroom were a nightclub in disguise. I excused myself from Matthew, saying I needed the restroom, and went to get some air. I needed walls, silence, a door between me and that damned necklace. In the less lit hallway leading to the restrooms, crisscrossed by the comings and goings of servers with trays, I passed Hector Montgomery. He had his phone pressed to his ear, and his face was tense, loaded with stress. The charming expression had been wiped away, as if someone had flipped a switch on his charisma. He didn't see me. He was too focused on his conversation. I heard him say in a low but urgent tone that they needed this wedding to happen, and that the Baxter family has more than enough money to cover our situation. There was a heavy silence as he listened to the person on the other end, and then he added, "We just have to hold on until the ceremony. Then everything will be sorted out. Trust me, we're almost there." He hung up and walked back toward the ballroom, his salesman's smile slipping back on like a mask, smoothing his jacket, straightening his shoulders. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding harder than the DJ's bass line. My grandmother's necklace took a back seat, replaced by something more urgent, bigger, more dangerous. The Baxter family had money. What money? My parents had a decent house, yes, a well-kept lawn, a recent paint job, but I knew for a fact it had a second mortgage because I had been secretly paying it for the last 4 years. Matthew had a stable job, nothing spectacular, enough for an apartment, a modest car, and vacations paid in installments. There was no family fortune, no secret trust fund, no hidden inheritance. So why was Hector so sure there was? And more importantly, what exactly was their situation that needed to be covered by us? I went back to the ballroom and spent the next hour watching the Montgomerys like a hawk watching its prey. Every smile, every handshake, every perfectly timed laugh. Now that I knew something was wrong, the cracks were visible everywhere. Hector kept checking his phone. His jaw tensed every time he read a message. His fingers twitched around his glass. Veronica's jewels were stunning, but she kept touching them nervously, as if afraid they'd disappear if she got distracted for a second. And Isabel, perfect Isabel, had a hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with desperation, with urgency. Her laughs were half a second too loud, her caresses a little too studied. And then the pieces started to click into place. The Montgomerys thought my family had money. Why? It hit me like a ton of bricks. For 4 years, I had been sending money to my parents anonymously through the Birchwood Group. Every month, a payment arrived to cover the mortgage, utilities, medical expenses. When my father had his knee surgery, I covered that too. I remember signing that transfer from an airport between layovers without a second thought. I never put my name on it. The deposits came under the group's name like a discreet benefactor. I didn't want thanks or questions. I just wanted to help from a distance without putting myself in the line of fire of judgment or expectations. My parents never knew it was me, and apparently, my mother decided it had to be Matthew. Of course. In her mind, her golden boy was taking care of them in secret, the responsible, successful son she always knew he'd be. I could just imagine her bragging to her friends after church. How generous Matthew was. How well he was investing. How he was supporting the family. The money I sent, the sacrifices I made, the sleepless nights I spent crunching numbers, and he got the credit without even knowing it. The irony was so thick you could have walked into the party and ordered a drink with it. So the Montgomerys did their research. They saw a house with mysteriously covered payments. They heard Lorraine bragging about her son's investments to anyone who would listen. They saw a family that seemed to have hidden wealth, a discreet but constant source of money, and they targeted Matthew like sharks smelling blood in the water. But there was one huge problem. That money wasn't Matthew's. There was no family fortune. The Montgomerys were chasing a mirage, and when they found out the truth, they would leave my family with the disaster, with the financial and emotional wreckage, unless someone stopped them. And for the first time that night, I felt something other than resentment, a cold fire of responsibility. I found Simon near the service entrance, clipboard in hand, coordinating the catering, giving quiet instructions. When he saw me, his professional mask softened into genuine warmth. He asked quietly if everything was all right, calling me Ms. Baxter before I shot him a look. He quickly corrected himself and said, "Valerie," remembering the instruction to remain incognito. I asked him for a favor. I needed information on the Montgomerys, anything. Records, notes, articles, background checks, whatever a good, curious manager could find in less than a night. Simon didn't ask why. I always appreciated that about him. He was the kind of man who understood that sometimes questions just complicate what's already been decided. He just nodded and said he'd see what he could get. I watched him disappear down a side corridor, already dialing a number on his phone. I returned to the ballroom trying to act normal, and that's when Isabel found me. She appeared at my side like a ghost in a designer dress, with a smile so sweet it could give you cavities. Her perfume enveloped her like a cloud, vanilla, jasmine, something expensive and aggressive. She suggested we talk in private to get to know each other, she said, with that intonation people use when they have no intention of actually getting to know you. She took my arm as if we were lifelong friends and led me to a corner near the restrooms, where the music was muffled and there was less foot traffic. As soon as we were out of earshot, her smile evaporated as if it had never been real. She told me she knew all about me, drawing out the word as if it were a poisoned gift. She knew I sent money home every month, playing the good daughter from afar. And then she dropped what was confusing her. Why would someone who can barely afford her own apartment send money to a family that doesn't even want her? I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my face neutral. That poker face I'd learned in meetings with bankers. She continued, savoring every word as if she were chewing a decadent dessert. She said Matthew told her everything, that I had always been jealous of him, that I couldn't stand not being the favorite, that the family only tolerated me out of pity, that everyone knew it but me. She smiled again, but this time the smile was a sharp knife without a hint of warmth. She said she was going to marry Matthew, that she was going to be part of the family, and that, honestly, it would be better for everyone if I just stayed away. "No one's going to miss you," she finished, calling me dead weight. Then she patted my arm as if consoling a petulant child and walked away, her dress swishing as if she were on a runway. I stood there, leaning against the cold hallway wall, processing. Isabel thought I was broke. She thought the money was coming from Matthew. She had no idea who I was. It was like watching someone brag about their amazing rental car to the owner of the entire rental agency. And honestly, if arrogance burned calories, Isabel would be invisible, a disembodied echo. Simon appeared beside me a few minutes later, pulling me from my thoughts. He had a folder in his hand and his face was pale, his usual composure broken. The man who was always unflappable in the face of chaotic weddings and impossible conventions looked genuinely worried. "You need to see this," he said. We moved to an even more discreet side hallway, out of sight, and in the damp silence of the service area, I opened the folder and started to read. Financial records, court documents, hastily printed news clippings. The further I read, the colder my body felt, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. The Montgomerys were not who they said they were. Their real estate empire was a house of cards built on lies and other people's money. They were 6 months, maybe less, from bankruptcy and under federal investigation. This wedding wasn't about love. It was a carefully constructed escape plan. There were names of companies I'd never heard of, addresses that didn't exist, promises of impossible returns. I saw numbers, dates, lawsuits, and every line was an alarm bell. I went to the parking garage, to my car, because I needed privacy to think without music, without lights, without eyes on me. The overhead lights in the garage flickered as if they were in shock too, casting short, trembling shadows on the concrete. I sat in the driver's seat, closed the door, and the sudden silence buzzed in my ears. The documents painted a horrific picture. Hector and Veronica weren't just in debt. They had been running what was essentially a Ponzi scheme for years. They collected money from investors for projects that either didn't exist or were inflated beyond reality. They paid off the early investors with money from the later ones, the classic scam, the oldest trick with a new dress. But the castle was crumbling. Investors were asking questions, auditors were sniffing around, and the feds had already opened a case. They needed a quick exit, a life raft in the shape of a wealthy family. And that's where my brother, Matthew, came in. I understood their logic, as twisted as it was. Marry into a family that seemed to have money, latch onto that reputation, and at least have somewhere to hide when it all blew up. Gain access to accounts, properties, lines of credit, contacts. It could be even worse. Maybe they planned to drain my family's assets before disappearing to start the fraud somewhere else, with another name, in another city. What they didn't know was that my family had nothing. The house was mortgaged, Matthew's salary was average, and the only steady flow of money to the Baxters was mine, and I could cut it off with a single phone call. The Montgomerys were about to find out they had chosen the wrong family, and when they did, they would abandon Matthew faster than a sinking ship. A part of me, the hurt, tired part, wanted to let it happen. Let my mother feel the weight of giving away my inheritance without a thought. Let my brother taste what it feels like to be discarded, deceived, used. Let them all taste the metallic tang of consequences. But I couldn't. As much as they had hurt me, as much as I had spent years learning to live without them, they were still my family. Matthew was still the boy who taught me to ride a bike, holding the back of the seat until he suddenly let go and yelled, "Look, Val, you're doing it!" My mother was still the woman who stayed up with me when I had the chicken pox, changing my sweaty sheets and singing softly, even if she later decided I wasn't worthy in her comparisons. Family is complicated. You can love someone and be furious with them at the same time, feel betrayed and still want to protect them even when they don't deserve it. So I made a decision in that cold car, the folder open on my lap. I was going to expose the Montgomerys and save my family, my way. They wouldn't see it coming from me. Not the country bumpkin, not the invisible sister. First, I called my lawyer, Rebecca Thorne. She answered on the second ring, even though it was 8 p.m., which is why I pay her what I do. From the first day I hired her, I knew she was the type who didn't scare easily. I summarized the situation in quick sentences. I told her I had documents, that I suspected fraud, that there was a wedding in progress with my brother at the center of the hurricane, and I asked how quickly she could verify what was in the folder. Rebecca didn't waste time on dramatic commentary. She said she'd have confirmation in under an hour. She asked if there was any immediate physical danger. I told her no, just a lot of flowers and champagne. She let out a small laugh, ended the call, and got to work. Next, I called Natalie Dixon, a forensic accountant I'd worked with on a complicated acquisition 2 years ago. Natalie was a magician with records, one of those people who can look at a spreadsheet and tell you what you had for breakfast and how many times you chewed it. I sent her photos of the key documents, the balance sheets, the company names, the dates, and asked her to dig deeper, to cross-reference information, to look for patterns. She didn't need any more than that. When I hung up, I was left alone with the distant hum of the parking garage's ventilation system and the muffled echo of music from the party. And if you're enjoying this story, I'll ask for a second of your time, leave a like and a comment. It really helps a lot, and I value every single one, even if I can't reply to them all. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and sharing this chaos with me. Now, let's get back to what Valerie did. Natalie called me back in 40 minutes, maybe less, her voice tight with the kind of excitement someone gets when they've just found something huge. I could almost picture her, glasses perched on the tip of her nose, screen in front of her filled with columns of numbers. She told me I was right. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, the kind they teach in courses to say, never do this. But there was an even more interesting part, the part that set off all her professional alarms. She had searched the Montgomery surname in other states and found an identical pattern in Santa Fe, New Mexico from 3 years ago. Same fraud, same structure, different names, different companies, a different story for their cover. Then she dropped the worst and best news at the same time. The bride's name wasn't Isabel. She paused dramatically, as if she knew this detail was a direct hit. She asked if I was ready. I told her yes, not to spare me anything. And Natalie told me her real name, Paula Rivers. She also told me that those parents weren't even her parents. They were partners in a long-running scam, and they'd been at it for at least a decade. Different identities, different victims, the same game with new scenery. I sat in the car with the folder on my lap and started to laugh. That humorless laugh that escapes when absurdity overtakes anger. These people had more identities than a celebrity has ex-spouses. Paula, Isabel, and next year probably Danielle, or Camilla, or something that sounds like money. My phone vibrated with a text from Matthew. I stared at it for a moment before opening it, as if delaying it could delay everything else. It said he needed to talk, that something about Isabel felt weird, that there were things that didn't add up. Contradictory stories, strange silences, questions she dodged. I checked the time. 5 minutes to 9, right when Hector was scheduled to give his big welcome toast to the family. Too late, brother. You should have trusted that feeling an hour ago or years ago when you doubted everything except Mom. Still, better late than never. His message told me something important. Matthew was starting to wake up, even if it was by getting slapped in the face. I got out of the car and walked toward the hotel. The night air was warm, humid, and somewhere inside, a con artist in a white dress was about to have the worst night of her life. I had never been so aware of the sound of my own boots on the pavement. I walked back into the Monarch Hotel with a different energy. Before, I was the invisible sister, the country bumpkin everyone looked down on. Now, I was a woman with a plan, and most dangerously, with proof. Simon was waiting for me near the service entrance, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity, as if he'd accidentally stumbled into an episode of a police procedural. He told me he'd been watching the Montgomerys and something was definitely off. He said Hector had made 4 calls in the last hour, each one leaving him more agitated, that Veronica had almost dropped a tray when she bumped into a server because she was distracted, and that Isabel had disappeared for 15 minutes and returned with slightly red eyes. I told Simon I needed the audiovisual system ready. During the 9 p.m. toast, we were going to give the guests a presentation they wouldn't forget. Simon didn't blink. He just said, "Understood," as if confirming a wine order. He asked what kind of presentation, and I handed him a USB drive I always carried in my purse, because you never know when you'll need technology to ruin someone's night. On it were scanned copies of the most incriminating documents, along with everything Natalie had sent me. Court records from New Mexico, financial statements showing the fraud, photos of Paula Rivers from 3 years ago, with a different look, but the same cold eyes, and a trail of lies spanning more than a decade, linking states, surnames, and companies. I told him that as soon as Hector started his toast, I wanted everything on the screens, every document, every photo, every piece of proof. Simon took the USB with a barely visible smile and said he always knew working with me would be interesting, but this was on another level. He added that he would alert security to discreetly monitor the doors. He headed toward the control booth as my phone vibrated again. It was Rebecca, confirming everything with surgical precision. The Montgomerys were under federal investigation, and most importantly, she had called the lead investigator, Agent Carmen Riley, who had been trying to track them for months, following leads that evaporated one after another. These people moved, changed names, and were always one step ahead. Until tonight. Rebecca told me Agent Riley and her team were already on their way and would be outside the hotel at 9:15, ready to move in as soon as the evidence was made public, and they were sure the guests understood who they had been rubbing elbows with. Everything was falling into place. The trap was set. All that was left was to wait for the exact moment. I found a spot at the back of the ballroom where I could see everything without being seen. I leaned against a column half hidden by a ridiculously large potted plant. Isabel was back to working the room with her fake smile, plastered on like waterproof paint. Matthew stood beside her, playing the perfect fiancé, not knowing his future was about to explode into 1,000,000 pieces in front of an audience of over 100 people. My mother was chatting with Veronica as if they were old friends, two women with nothing in common except their ability to make me feel small. Veronica nodded, touching her necklace, laughing a second too late. My mother was surely telling her how wonderful Matthew was, how self-sacrificing, how he had always been there for them. I checked my watch. 8:52. The phone vibrated again. Matthew asking where I was, repeating that he needed to talk, that Hector kept slipping away, that Isabel was dodging questions about her past, that details weren't adding up. He said maybe he was being paranoid, maybe it was just wedding jitters, but something in his gut felt wrong. I read the message without answering right away. A part of me wanted to warn him, to grab his arm, pull him out the service door, and tell him the truth in a whisper. But if I did, he might warn her, and I couldn't risk that. I couldn't lose Paula Isabel Rivers just as she was about to fall. I replied simply, "Let's talk after the toast. Wait." At 8:56, I saw Hector adjusting his tie near the small stage where the DJ was set up. He had his mask of confidence and charm back on. He ran a hand through his hair, practiced a smile in the dark reflection of a screen, and lifted a glass to test its weight. He had no idea what was coming. I remembered what Isabel had called me. Dead weight. No one's going to miss you. Stay away. The thing about people who underestimate you is that they never see you coming. They're so busy looking down on you that they miss the moment you stand up and step on their shadow. At 8:59, Hector stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. The DJ slowly lowered the music until only a low murmur remained. The guests turned, their glasses ready for the toast, as if choreographed. I caught Simon's eye from a distance. He gave me a minimal gesture, the signal we had agreed upon. The screens behind the stage were showing a slideshow of photos of Matthew and Isabel. Happy in a restaurant, happy on a beach, happy at a fair with cotton candy, happy in a world built on lies. Not for long. Hector cleared his throat and began his speech. He thanked everyone for being there. He said that when his daughter brought Matthew home, he knew this young man was special, that he reminded him of himself as a young man. Ironic, I thought, that he was hardworking, honest, a family man. I almost laughed. His daughter. The daughter who wasn't his daughter, the daughter whose real name he probably had to remind himself of every morning in the mirror. Hector spoke of family, legacy, grandchildren, a bright future, and how honored they were to be joining the Baxters, how they admired their values and stability. Every word was a lie, and every lie was seconds away from being laid bare in front of an audience with cell phones in their hands. Hector raised his glass to love, to family, to forever. I felt the room hold its breath, as if everyone was waiting for the clinking of glasses. I took out my phone and sent Simon a single message. Now. My finger trembled slightly as I tapped the screen. The screens flickered. For a second, many thought it was a technical glitch. The photo slideshow stopped. Matthew and Isabel were frozen in a static smile, and then they disappeared, replaced by an official document with seals and legal language projected in large format. Hector's smile froze on his face. His eyes locked on the screen behind him. It was a file from New Mexico, dated 3 years prior. An investigation for fraud. And there, listed as a person of interest, was a name no one in that room knew. Paula Rivers. A murmur spread like a wave, growing in volume, moving from table to table. Brows furrowed, eyes narrowed, hands lowered their glasses without toasting. Hector fumbled with the microphone, his face going from red to pale in seconds, his forehead beaded with sweat. He stammered that it must be a mistake. He yelled toward the control booth to fix it. He said it was the wrong file, but the screens kept changing. Financial records appeared, showing investors' money flowing into shell companies. Arrows marked the inflow and outflow of funds, unrealistic rates of return. Then, an article about a real estate scam that had left dozens of families without their savings, with photos of half-built houses and victim testimonies. Then photos. A younger Paula Rivers, different hair color, darker, a different cut, but the same eyes. Beside her, Hector and Veronica at a charity event under different names, with smiles identical to the ones they wore tonight. Isabel was frozen in the middle of the dance floor, her glass trembling in her hand. For the first time all night, her mask completely fell away. She looked terrified, her breathing shallow, her chin trembling. Matthew was looking from the screen to Isabel, then back to the screen, his mind trying to piece together things that suddenly made sense. The evasiveness, the stories without dates, the insistence on getting married quickly, the sooner the better. Hector tried to make his way to the exit, stumbling off the stage, but two of my guards planted themselves in front of him with polite expressions and firm stances. Veronica grabbed his arm, whispering frantically, something I couldn't hear, but there was nowhere to go. The ballroom seemed to shrink to close in on them. Then I moved forward. I walked through the parting crowd, my boots echoing on the marble like soft, deliberate heartbeats. All eyes fell on me. The country bumpkin, the nobody, the dead weight. The whispers died down. Simon's voice came over the speakers, calm and professional, with a slight echo. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the owner of the Monarch Hotel and CEO of the Birchwood Group. Please welcome Ms. Valerie Baxter. The silence was brutal. You could have dropped a pin and heard it bounce 3 times. My mother went white, her mouth half open, her glass stalled midway. Matthew's jaw literally dropped, unable to close. Even Isabel, in the midst of her panic, looked genuinely shocked, as if this detail wasn't in her script. I took the microphone from Hector's limp hand. He offered no resistance. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice was clear, steady, which I was grateful for. I apologized for the interruption, but said I thought they deserved to know who they were really celebrating. I pointed to the screens and explained, with the calm of someone who has practiced much harder speeches, that Hector and Veronica Montgomery were not who they claimed to be, that their empire was a fraud, that their wealth was stolen from innocent investors, and that Isabel was actually named Paula Rivers, a con artist who had been repeating the same scheme for over a decade, jumping from state to state, changing her name like someone changes a dress. Isabel finally reacted. She screamed that I was lying, that I was a jealous nobody, that I was making it all up because I couldn't stand to see Matthew happy, that I had always wanted to ruin his life. Her voice broke mid-sentence, but she kept clinging to any narrative that might save her. I smiled and said, "How interesting." Then I asked, looking at the guests as much as at her, "Did I also make up the federal investigation that's been tracking you for 2 years?" I mentioned the arrest warrants issued last month. I said I was curious how I could have faked the fact that Agent Carmen Riley and her team were, at that very moment, waiting outside the hotel. As if on cue, the ballroom doors opened, and 4 people in suits entered, their badges visible, their expressions serious, with the posture of people who know exactly what they're doing. The music was already silent. The sound of their footsteps on the floor was crisp and clear. Isabel's face crumbled. Hector tried to run toward a side exit. He made it a few yards before Agent Riley stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. She told him calmly, with practiced authority, that Hector Montgomery, or whatever his real name was under arrest for wire fraud, investment fraud, and conspiracy. Among other charges she listed off like a grocery list. Veronica started to cry, her mascara running down her perfectly made-up face, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that they could explain, that everything was being misinterpreted, that they had good lawyers. One of the agents asked her to calm down while they read her rights. Isabel, Paula, whatever her name was, turned to Matthew one last time and begged him not to let his sister do this to them, that they loved each other, that he had to believe her, because what they had was real, that nothing else mattered. Matthew looked at her for a long moment. I saw the war behind his eyes, the collapse of a sandcastle built on false promises. The woman he thought he loved versus the undeniable evidence scrolling across the screens and in the agent's words. And then he did something I never expected. He took a step back. That simple movement was a complete earthquake. He said, his voice broken but certain, "I don't know who you are. I don't know who any of you are. I can't believe a single thing I've ever heard from your mouth." Isabel's expression shifted from pleading to rage in a second, as if someone had changed the channel. She lunged at me, screaming that I had ruined everything, that I was supposed to be a nobody, that I was the smelly little country bumpkin who thought money made her important. Security stopped her before she could touch me. 2 guards positioned themselves between us with fluid movements. I leaned in just enough for only her to hear and said quietly, "This country bumpkin owns the room you're standing in, pays the salary of the people escorting you out, and will sleep perfectly fine tonight knowing exactly who she is. Something you can't say." They led her away, still screaming, her designer dress wrinkled, her hair a mess, her heels wobbling, her fabricated life crumbling with every step, like sequins falling off a cheap costume. I turned to the guests who were still in shock, eyes wide, phones in their hands, unsure if it was appropriate to record. I said that the catering was already paid for and it would be a shame to waste good food. I told them the bar would remain open for anyone who wanted to stay, that I understood if some preferred to leave, but that no one was in any danger. A nervous laugh rippled through the room, releasing some of the tension. The DJ, bless him, took the initiative and put on something upbeat but discreet, as if trying to restart a failing heart. The engagement party was over, but the night was just beginning. The next hour felt like a fever dream. The 3 con artists were let out in handcuffs while people watched in silence or whispered in small groups. Isabel was still hurling empty threats as they put her in an unmarked car, promising impossible revenge. In 15 minutes, she went from future Mrs. Baxter to future inmate, which has to be a record, even for a professional. Later, when the ballroom had lost some of its sparkle, and the flowers were beginning to smell slightly tired, Matthew found me near the bar. He looked like a man who had woken up from a nightmare, only to realize he was still in it. Red eyes, trembling hands, his tie loose, his world shattered at his feet. He asked me how I knew, how I found out. What the hell had just happened? I told him the truth. I listened. I watched. I paid attention. Everything I've been doing my whole life while everyone else ignored me. I told him about the hallway, what I heard, how I asked for help, how we cross-referenced the information. I didn't give him technical details he didn't need. I gave him the essentials. He was quiet, and then he said he was sorry. He knew it wasn't enough, that it didn't cover years of treating me like a family ornament, something that was there but didn't matter. He said he never really wondered what I was doing, how I was living. He just assumed I was out there, getting by like always, and he leaned on that comfortable idea. I watched his face, waiting for the trick, the defensive spin, but you also. But there was no trick. I saw real, broken, uncomfortable regret. I told him sorry was a start, not an ending. We stood there in silence for a moment. 2 siblings who had spent decades as strangers, seeing each other for the first time without masks or borrowed stories. Then my mother appeared. Lorraine looked smaller, as if what had happened had shrunk her from the inside, as if her shoulders could no longer hold up so much posture. She approached slowly, without her usual confidence, without her chin held high. She started to say she didn't know, she never imagined, that she only... But I cut her off with a gentle gesture. I didn't have the patience for a theatrical performance tonight. I took out my phone and showed her the screen. Bank records, statements, 4 years of payments on their mortgage, their utilities, their medical bills. All from the Birchwood Group, all from me, month after month, like a metronome. I told her she thought Matthew was supporting them and that she bragged everywhere about her generous, successful son. I let that silence fall like a heavy blanket, and then I said, it was me. It was always me. My voice was more tired than angry, and that caught her by surprise. My mother looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, opening and closing her mouth without being able to speak, as if the words had dried up in her throat. I told her I didn't do it for thanks or for recognition or to buy love. I did it because they were my family, even when they made me feel like I wasn't part of theirs. Her eyes filled with real tears, not the theatrical tears of family gatherings. Thick, clumsy tears that came from a deep and rarely visited place. She whispered my name, Valerie, as if saying it for the first time, as if she'd always just called me daughter automatically, without thinking about who she was talking to. She raised a hand as if to touch me and let it fall halfway. I didn't hug her. It wasn't the time. Sometimes distance is the only honest way to be close. And then there was a commotion on the dance floor. My grandmother's necklace, my necklace, was on the floor where Isabel had thrown it in her fit of rage. I saw it glinting between two fallen petals. A bridesmaid almost stepped on it before backing away. Matthew went. He picked it up carefully as if a breath could break it. He looked at it for a moment in his palm and came back to me. He said, his voice thick, "This should have always been yours. I didn't know Mom had given it away. It never occurred to me to ask. And I'm sorry." He opened my hand and placed it in my palm with a slow, almost reverent gesture. The weight felt right, familiar, like something that had been missing for years had finally returned to its place, right at the center of my chest, even though I hadn't put it on yet. My mother watched us, crying, and said she had been wrong about everything, that she had no excuses, that she didn't know how to fix so much. I didn't argue, but I didn't humiliate her either. There would be time for difficult conversations, for reproaches, for uncomfortable silences. At that moment, I was just tired, drained, the adrenaline leaving my body. A guest approached, his tie loosened, and asked if the party was still on, confused but hopeful, like someone who didn't want to throw the night away. I looked around. The ice swans were melting. The champagne fountain was still running. Half the guests had left, but the other half seemed determined to get their money's worth from the open bar and maybe dance their nerves away. I shrugged and gestured to the DJ to keep going. The night was already weird enough. What harm could a little dancing do? A group of young people hit the dance floor as if nothing had happened, because at a certain age, you think everything is just an anecdote. Some adults followed with tentative moves. Others stayed at their tables, processing, sending texts, maybe Googling Paula Rivers fraud. I tucked the necklace into the inside pocket of my jacket, close to my heart. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my office at the Monarch Hotel on the top floor, looking out at the skyline as the morning sun streamed through the large windows. I had a half-finished cup of coffee, and the city seemed quieter than usual. For the first time in years, I felt a strange kind of peace, as if I had closed a circle I didn't even know was still open. The con artists were finished. The prosecutor's office had enough evidence to charge them with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Paula Rivers, the woman who called me a smelly country bumpkin, was in custody awaiting trial, with a bail so high not even her fake parents could afford it. Turns out when you spend decades stealing from people, you don't have many friends left to bail you out when it all comes crashing down. The story was local news for a week. They called me for a statement. I declined, but the press did its thing anyway. Some headlines talked about the great fraud uncovered at engagement party. Others focused on the family drama, because morbid curiosity always sells. One headline even called me the smelly country bumpkin who owned the room. I had that one framed. It hangs right here, next to my door, where I see it every morning when I come in. Every time I look at it, I remember that the labels other people put on you mean nothing compared to what you build when no one is watching. Matthew came to visit me yesterday. It was the first time he had seen my office, my team, the life I built without anyone's help. He walked in slowly, looking at the furniture, the photos of the other hotels on the walls, the organized folders on my desk. He walked around touching things as if he couldn't believe they were real, running his hand along the edge of the conference table, reading the names on the director's plaques. He told me he had spent years thinking he knew me and that he was wrong about everything, that I had always been in the blurry periphery of his vision. I told him we had a lot of years to make up for, and maybe we should just start now, without any grand speeches. We went for a real lunch, not a family obligation filled with empty chatter and passive-aggressive comments. I chose a table at the hotel restaurant by the window, no special reservations. We talked about childhood, about hiding under the dining room table to listen to the adults' conversations. We talked about our parents, about the things we never said to each other. I told him how lonely I had felt for so many years. He told me about the pressure of being the perfect son and how he sometimes wanted to fail on purpose, just to see what would happen. It wasn't perfect or easy. There were awkward silences, moments when neither of us knew what to say, but it was honest, and that was more than we had ever had. My mother started therapy last week. She called me with a small, insecure voice, so different from the woman who used to make me feel like a constant disappointment with a single look. She said she wanted to understand why she treated me the way she did, that she wanted to be better, that her therapist had talked to her about patterns, favoritism, about how she was repeating things she experienced as a child. I told her I appreciated the effort and that we could take it slow. Building trust takes time, and I wasn't about to give her immediate forgiveness just because she was now willing to look at what she had previously ignored. But at least we were finally building something, instead of watching it silently crumble. That same morning, I was hosting a business breakfast at the hotel restaurant. Investors, partners, people talking about expansion, numbers, new cities, normal things for my life now. The tables were set meticulously, the coffee perfectly hot, the dishes gleaming under the soft light. Then a nervous young woman walked in, dressed in simple clothes, her hair in a practical ponytail, her eyes wide, clearly out of her element. Her hands were clenched around the strap of her cheap purse, her shoes worn but clean. She looked around with a mix of awe and fear. One of my investors, a man named Gerald, the kind with too much money and too little class, made a comment loud enough for everyone to hear. He asked who let her in, saying it was a private event, that reception is getting sloppy with the filter. I watched him for a few seconds, feeling an old irritation bubble up. I stood up. I walked over to the young woman and extended my hand. I called her by name, warmly, Nora, and said I was so glad she could make it, that it was an honor to have her there. Her eyes widened even more, surprised I knew who she was. Then I looked at everyone and asked them to meet Nora Peters, this year's winner of the Birchwood Group Scholarship. There was a general shuffle of chairs, a shift in the atmosphere. I told them that Nora grew up in a small town, that she worked 2 jobs to pay for community college, one at a gas station overnight, the other cleaning rooms at a roadside motel, and that in the fall, she would be starting the hospitality management program at Cornell University. The room fell silent for a second, as if everyone had to recalibrate their perception. Gerald suddenly found his coffee fascinating, unable to look up. I sat Nora at my table, the same table as the investors, the same table as those who believe they are worth more because of their money or their contacts. She whispered a, "Thank you," overwhelmed, her voice trembling, and I told her not to thank me yet. The real work was just beginning. But I also told her that if she ever felt like she didn't belong somewhere, to remember that the people who build the most beautiful things almost always start with nothing more than grit and stubborn dreams, and that her story didn't have to look like anyone else's. During breakfast, some of the investors went over to talk to her, to ask where she was from, what she wanted to do. I heard her answer, shy at first, then more confident, talking about hotels like someone talking about something they love but have never had up close. I saw myself reflected in those wide eyes, in that fear of saying the wrong thing, and I felt something like pride, not for myself, but for the possibility that another smelly country bumpkin, in the eyes of someone ignorant, could find her place without having to fight the same battles I fought alone. After breakfast, I stayed in the lobby, watching the guests come and go. Executives with briefcases, tourists with hats and backpacks, families with kids dragging stuffed animals across the floor, all of them walking on floors I bought, sleeping in beds I paid for, using elevators I authorized, without knowing who made it all possible. And that was okay. I didn't need them to know. Anonymity had become an ally, not a punishment. People will always try to make you feel small because of where you come from, how you talk, how you dress, the name of your town on a map. Let them. While they're busy looking down on you, they won't see the moment you rise. I learned that lesson a long time ago in a little town where I was never enough, listening to comparisons that scraped at my soul. I carried it for years through effort, doubt, and voices telling me I would never amount to anything, that I was dreaming too big for my circumstances. And now here I was, standing in my hotel, surrounded by everything I built without asking for permission. I touched my neck. My grandmother's necklace rested there, warm against my skin. I looked at my reflection in one of the glass walls. I no longer saw the half-erased girl, but the author of her own story. I smiled slightly. The smelly country bumpkin smelling success from miles away, and this time, no one could take it from me. And that's the end of the story. If you made it to the end with Valerie, you know, nothing stops us when we stop believing those who want to keep us small. If you liked this story, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what hit you the hardest. Your support helps me keep telling stories like this one.